It was meant to be a relaxed, witty evening conversation, one of those rare moments when the serious and the satirical meet in harmony. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, had accepted an invitation to join Jon Stewart on his primetime show, intending to promote his latest mental health campaign and perhaps shed light on the humanitarian projects he had quietly nurtured since stepping down from royal duties. The studio was buzzing, the audience electric, eager to witness a rare, uncensored conversation between a former senior royal and one of America's most incisive comedic minds. At first, the banter was effortless. Don teased Harry about his California life, asking whether he preferred tea or oat milk lattes now. The crowd laughed as Harry grinned and played along. It was light, it was funny, and it disarmed the usual stiffness that followed Harry in formal appearances. But as with all things involving Stewart, the mood pivoted fast. Laughter turned to friction as Jon transitioned from jokes to sharp observations about privilege, power, and public responsibility, and suddenly, the space between them felt less like a stage and more like a courtroom. Jon began pressing on the issue of Harry's departure from the royal family, asking if his calls for privacy were contradictory to his continued presence in public platforms, interviews, documentaries, and published memoirs. Harry, visibly measured, replied that privacy didn't mean invisibility and that he and Meghan had never sought to disappear from public life, but rather to control how their story was told. Jon raised an eyebrow and quipped, "But isn't publishing a book called Spare, kind of like whispering from the rooftops?" The audience laughed, but Harry didn't. He leaned in and said, "There's a difference between telling your truth and having it told for you by others." Jon nodded, but his tone sharpened. "But if everyone's truth is a brand, how do we know where authenticity ends and PR begins?" Harry, slightly bristling now, replied, "That's a question the entire media industry needs to answer, not just me." The tension began to thicken, and the charm of the opening moments faded quickly into philosophical combat. The crowd grew quieter as Jon dove into more sensitive areas, referencing the criticism that Harry and Meghan had received for speaking about mental health while launching high-profile business deals and branded partnerships. "Do you ever worry," Jon asked, "that in trying to humanize the crown, you've inadvertently commodified pain?" Harry hesitated. His jaw tightened slightly before he responded. "What I worry about is a world that punishes vulnerability and then profits from the spectacle of it. If sharing my experience helps someone else, then it's worth it." Jon didn't smile. He followed with, "But when that sharing becomes a Netflix deal, how do we know it's not just a product?" The question lingered. Harry's composure remained intact, but his silence spoke volumes. He eventually said, "Maybe that says more about how the world receives stories than how they're told." A ripple of tension passed through the audience. This was no longer a playful interview, it was a dismantling, a dissection of ethics in the public eye. Then Jon touched the third rail, monarchy. He asked Harry directly if he still saw value in the institution he had left behind. Harry, breathing deeper now, replied that the concept of service was valuable, but traditions must evolve. Jon pressed, "But can you evolve something that was built to remain unchanged?" Harry responded, "You can't evolve something if no one challenges it." Jon raised the stakes by referencing colonialism, privilege, and the fact that Harry had once represented the very institution that had profited from global exploitation. "Isn't it convenient," Jon said, "to disavow a system only after it stops serving you?" That moment broke something. Harry, blinking rapidly, responded with an edge, "That's an unfair characterization. I spoke out when I saw harm being done. I didn't wait, I acted when I had clarity." Jon didn't retreat. "But would you have acted if you weren't personally affected?" he asked. That question stung. The crowd grew utterly silent. Harry sat still, staring at Jon. His eyes had changed, not angry, but deeply wounded. It was clear that Harry felt cornered, not by questions, but by the presumption behind them. He said softly, "You think I had to lose my peace, my family's safety, to earn your belief?" That's the point, Jon. People only think it matters when it breaks you publicly. Jon didn't reply immediately. The gravity of Harry's words hung there, raw and unfiltered. The host, known for cutting interviews down to their hypocritical core, was faced with a man who had lived through a media war zone. But Jon, committed to the pursuit of truth, said, "Sometimes it's not about belief, it's about accountability." That was the moment Harry's face changed. The diplomacy slipped. "Accountability goes both ways," he snapped. "What about the media? What about the systems that weaponize my wife's race, our grief, our words? Where's the accountability there?" His voice hadn't raised, but the fury was unmistakable. Jon, to his credit, nodded solemnly. "You're right," he said. "The media is broken, but so is the mechanism of celebrity. You escaped one palace and entered another." That line, poetic and brutal, left Harry speechless. The metaphor was powerful because it was true. The Duke had walked away from centuries of legacy, only to become an emblem of a different empire fame. And while he had earned empathy for his suffering, he was still swimming in a sea of attention. That contradiction was what Jon had tried to expose, but Harry, hearing that line, didn't answer. He leaned back, adjusted his blazer, and muttered something under his breath. Mike didn't catch it. What it did catch was the sound of Harry removing the clip-on transmitter and standing up. The room froze. There was no dramatic outburst, no flurry of words, just a silent decision. He stood, nodded to Jon without a smile, and walked off the stage. The audience sat stunned. Jon stared at the empty chair, mouth slightly open, clearly unsure if he'd gone too far. When the cameras returned, Jon looked directly into the lens and said, "Well, that wasn't how I thought this would end." The studio laughed nervously, but it didn't soften the awkwardness. A live walk-off, unplanned and unscripted, had just become the biggest moment of the show's season. Within minutes, it exploded across social media. Clips were dissected. Reactions polarized. Half the internet rallied to Harry's defense, saying Stewart had ambushed a guest under the guise of inquiry. Others praised Jon's line of questioning, arguing that public figures need more than applause, they need challenge. The hashtag Harry walks out trended in both the US and UK, with pundits on both sides of the Atlantic weighing in. Tabloids rejoiced. Journalists published op-eds. Think pieces emerged discussing trauma commodification, the ethics of celebrity storytelling, and the impossibility of authenticity in a commercial world. Some said it marked a turning point in how royals and former royals would be treated by the media. Others saw it as a tragic collision between truth and platform. Neither Jon nor Harry issued formal statements the next day. Jon opened his next show with a joke about scaring off royalty, but his tone was subdued. Harry was spotted at a veterans event days later, smiling, but reporters were blocked from asking about the interview. Royal experts speculated it would deepen the divide between Harry and the British press, while American analysts argued it proved Harry was no longer protected by narrative curation. He had stepped into the ring and taken a hit. But some argued it was the most real he had ever been on camera. Not polished, not strategic, just human, and hurt in the weeks that followed. The moment faded from trending hashtags but stayed etched in public memory. Jon returned to satire. Harry returned to philanthropy, but something had changed. The public had seen behind the curtain. Not to expose scandal, but to witness discomfort. And in that discomfort was truth. That the stories we tell ourselves about redemption, royalty, and resistance are rarely clean. They are messy, they clash, and they hurt. But maybe, just maybe, they matter more when they don't end in applause. They matter when they end in silence.